Dr. John H. Watson, 23rd of June, 1919, Seymour Mews, London, W1. It was a brisk autumn evening in the year 1897. My rounds over for the day, I found my steps wending towards Baker Street once more. I decided to pay a visit to Holmes. I found him to be in a retrospective frame of mind. Holmes had read carefully a note which the last post had brought him. Then, with the dry chuckle which was his nearest approach to a laugh, he tossed it over to me. Matilda Briggs was not the name of a young woman, Watson, he said in a reminiscent voice. It was a ship which is associated with the giant rat of Sumatra, a story for which the world is not yet prepared. Oh, blast. I can't even read my own handwriting.
Mrs. Watson, will you kindly leave that gramophone alone? I really blame myself, ladies and gentlemen. I ought never to have put the idea into friend Watson's head in the first place. Oh, that is why I've had it brought to here. Now, indeed, you may ask yourselves, where is here precisely? Well, of course, none of this is real. This is the attic space of my mind, the lumber room of my imagination. Here, cast your eyes about, you will see the various disjecta of my former case histories. There, of course, we have the Abernethy affair. You'll recollect I was only able to ascertain the true horror of that case when, upon that warm summer's day, I ascertained the depth to which the parsley had sunk into the butter. Thereafter, truly a case of time and punishment. But there, of course, we have D for the Dundas separation case. You will recollect, will you not? Mr. Dundas, despite being a strict teetotaler, suddenly had fallen into a rather grotesque habit of at every meal time removing his dentures and flinging them into the unexpected embrace of Mrs. Dundas. Grotesque, ladies and gentlemen. You'll appreciate, will you not? I've always had an appreciation of the grotesque. You will cast your minds back to the affair of the Red-Headed League. Now, that began in a grotesque enough fashion, yet it did not end in an audacious attempt of bank robbery. Then, of course, the grotesque affair of the 5 orange pips. Now, that culminated in murder. I've always had a taste for the grotesque. Otherwise, how else to account for your presence here, particularly you, sir. Now you're all here, you may as well make yourselves useful. You will applaud if convenient, if inconvenient, you will applaud all the same. Draw yourselves closer toward me. You will see cigars in the coal scuttle, soda and the gasogene. Look over there. My collection of V's, indeed, is rather an admirable one. We have V for Victoria, V for Vipers, V for the voyage of the glorious God, to which friend Watson already has alluded. V for Vampire. Or to be more specific, the Sussex Vampire. Now, surely for a mixture of the modern and the medieval, who could scarce find a better instance. I am reminded of something that friend Watson once told me. Now, you understand, Watson has long had literary aspirations. He's even gone so far as to acquire the services of a man named Doyle. Doyle is an acquaintance with Mr. Abraham Stoker. Yes. Stoker, in his turn, has acted as literary agent for a rather staid Dutch professor of anthropology, Van Helsing. Van Helsing reprimanded Stoker for turning his I must say, his rather dry and anemic study of vampirism in Eastern Europe into what he deemed to be a tawdry shilling shocker, a penny dreadful named Dracula. As I've already said to Mr. Stoker, at what point is there in crying over spilt blood? Just as Stoker had had to remind Professor Van Helsing, so also have I often been driven to the same actions with friend Watson. Well, really, we appear to have been switched on to a Grimm's fairy tale. Please allow me to share this latest communication. We vampires. Sir, our client, Mr. Robert Ferguson, has made some inquiries from us in a communication illuminated concerning the vampires. As our firm specializes entirely in the assessment of machinery, quite. No matter how he comes within our purview, we have therefore recommended Mr. Ferguson to look upon you and to lay the matter before you. We are, sir, faithfully yours, Morrison, and Dodge. But then do vampires come within our purview? Rubbish! Ladies and gentlemen, what business do I have with undead revenants who can only be held firmly in their graves at night by driving a wooden stake up through their hearts? This agency stands flat-footed upon the ground, and there it must remain. The world is scarce big enough for me as it is. Ghosts need not apply. No, Rigger, I fear that we cannot take this Mr. Robert Ferguson at all seriously. Mrs. Hudson, the door! However, if nothing else, Mr. Ferguson is punctual. And so, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ferguson began his ascent of the 17 steps up to my rooms here in Baker Street. And as so many other individuals before him had made their entrances here upon this humble performance space, so now it was the turn of Mr. Ferguson also, whether for good or for evil. Only time would tell. Mr. Ferguson, pray be seated. I cannot thank you enough, Mr. Holmes, the doctor, for seeing me. The fact is, I would have come sooner, only the police would have laughed. Well, I'm a man of business. I do not know where to begin, but I beg of you, Mr. Holmes, I pray that you will banish the shadows that have overcast my family these past few weeks. You ought to understand I'm a man of business. The importation of nitrates, mainly. Overseas, I work. Peru. That is where I met my wife, my second wife, Maria. I believe before the end of the first week, I'd fallen in love with her. By the end of the second, I'd asked her to marry me. She said yes. But for all of that, there is a side to her that I do not know. I do not understand. Always there has been this veil of secrecy between the two of us. No, I have to say it. I was married before. She bore me a son, Jackie. He is a sweet lad, but 15 years of age. Now, Jackie, he had a fall from a tree when he was a child. He damaged his spine. In spite of this, he is the most loving, dutiful boy a man could hope for. Now, I admit, Jack he has very strong likes and dislikes. Well, I count my blessings. I admit that I am amongst his likes. Mrs. Ferguson, Maria, she has blessed me with the baby, a son. This is where Mr. Holmes it becomes so difficult for me. Maria, she hates Jackie. Twice she has wounded both of her children. Once she left an angry red wheal upon Jack's arm. Now, when asked her why, she merely says she hated the boy. But why? Well, he is a cripple. Surely that will be enough to soften anyone's heart toward him. He is so affectionate, Mr. Holmes. Jackie, he cannot understand why. Maria hates him so. Now, you understand, I would have come to you sooner, only our nursery maid, she was bribed by Maria, sworn to silence. Else I would have come to you then. Well, one day the maid was going out about her business when she heard a sound coming from the nursery. Well, she stopped what she was doing. She opened the door. She found my little baby in his crib. My wife, Maria, was stooped over him. There was a wound on his throat, blood trickling down. Well, the nursemaid would have come to me then, only Maria bribed her with £5, swore to silence. Why had my wife bitten him? Well, you may understand, Mr. Holmes, from that moment on, the maid did not leave the baby out of her sight. And yet, through all of that, just as a wolf watches jealously the lambs in the flock, so Maria regarded the maid. Well, eventually, Mr. Holmes, the maid could hold her tongue no more. She came to me. Well, when she told me, I was appalled. I said she was allowing her imagination to get the better of her. I will not have my wife slandered like that. I demanded her to apologize to Maria there and then. That's when I heard a sound coming from the nursery. My baby boy crying in pain. Well, I ran toward the door with the maid on my heels. So the curtains had been drawn. I saw my son lying in his cot. The sheets was drenched in blood. Maria stooped over him. I had her face up to the light. Oh, dear God! Maria was drinking my son's blood. The blood was trickling down her chin. Maria, why? She fled from the room, locked herself inside. No one has seen her since, apart from her maid from Peru, Dolores. Well, her maid, more of a friend. They have known each other for years. I don't know what to do, Mr. Holmes. I have sworn to honor, to protect Maria till my dying day, but now I know vampires do not exist. But I saw with my own eyes she was drinking my baby boy's blood. The police would laugh at me. Everyone would laugh at me. I beg of you, Mr. Holmes. You're the one man in England who can help. Please use all of your powers to banish this darkness that has overcome me. Vampires! Rubbish. Already there are one or two pertinent points that Mr. Ferguson had made. This boy, Jackie Ferguson, interested me greatly. A young lad of very strong likes and dislikes. Now, Ferguson informed me that in two instances, the children been injured. However, in the second, it was only the boy, Jackie Ferguson. That was suggestive, was it not? Still, It is a capital mistake, ladies and gentlemen, as I have found in my experience, to theorize before one has sufficient data. Otherwise, one twists facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. Well, I accepted Mr. Ferguson's trifling problem. However, nothing more could be gleaned by remaining here in Baker Street. And so that bleak November evening, friend Watson and I journeyed to Lamberley, the home of the Ferguson clan. It was Mr. Ferguson himself who admitted us to his home. A large, imposing hall. There, in a grand hearth, a fire blazed away, though I could see on an iron plate the other side of the flames, a date 1670, bearing testimony to the antiquity of the abode. You'll look about yourselves here. Up to the halfway point of the wall is the original. Oak timbers from that point on, replaced with yellow plaster. Now there, adorned with so many weapons and artifacts from South America, bearing testimony to the second Mrs. Ferguson's presence. At that instance, a spaniel who had been seated in a basket in the corner, upon seeing his master, limped painfully to its feet, his tail dragging upon the floor, licked Mr. Ferguson's hand. Mr. Ferguson, the dog, what is wrong with it? I don't know, Mr. Holmes. It came on all of a sudden, overnight. Spinal meningitis, the veterinary surgeon says. You must forgive me, Mr. Holmes. I need to see if Maria will see me. Now, Watson, of course, wished to see this Sussex Vampire for himself. However, I asked Ferguson to bring the baby down with me. I wish to make his acquaintance also. Now, even before I left Baker Street, the one logical solution to this affair, as suggested by the facts as known to me, had presented itself. All I now needed to do was to put my theory to the test. At that juncture, and Mr. Ferguson appeared cradling his babe in the arms. Well, little man, you have made rather a strange start in life, have you not? However, do not be afraid. I feel that there is light soon at the end of the tunnel. Now, at that point, there, standing in the doorway, the other son, the elder boy, Jackie. Do you see there his pale hair, his light blue eyes? Upon seeing his father, his face flushed with excitement, then he dashed across the room as best as his disability would allow, flung his arms about Mr. Ferguson in a manner that I found rather embarrassing. Mr. Ferguson disentangled himself and then introduced me to his son. Jack Ferguson regarded me with suspicion, as well he might. What a strange family tableau they made. There, Mr. Ferguson cradling his baby boy, the two of them being observed by Jackie Ferguson. If voila, my case was complete. I suggested to Jack Ferguson leave us now. There were matters that I wished to discuss with his father, also Mr. Ferguson. Pray, have the nursemaid take the baby back to his room. Now, in my experience, the least painful surgery is always by far the swiftest. Mr. Ferguson, your wife, Maria, is many things. She is a loving wife, a doting mother, but of course she is not a vampire. Now, the idea of Nosferatu being roaming abroad in the English countryside was at once a ridiculous one, as such creatures have no role to play within our nation's judicial system, and yet you had seen your wife drinking the child's blood, had you not? But may a wound not be sucked for some other reason than to draw blood? Think! Ah, poison. Look about us here. Imagine, if you will, that dagger to be plucked from the wall. Imagine if that could be dipped in some highly toxic substance, curare, for instance. Think how potentially fatal that could be. And yet, if one were to employ such a strategy, would it not be prudent to test the potency of the substance first? Which brings me to the incident of the dog, his overnight paralysis. The curare was tested first upon the spaniel. Mr. Ferguson, there is nothing quite so deceptive as an obvious fact. Once your wife, Maria, had already thwarted the attempt made upon a child. Yet she could not tell you, could she, what she suspected, for she knows how you dote upon Jack. But there are limits, are there not, even to a woman's patience? Mr. Ferguson, it was your own boy, Jack. Jealousy is a wonderful transformer of human nature. When I observed his reflection there in the glass of the French windows as he gazed upon you, in the loving way that you looked down upon the baby, I observed such jealousy, such cruel hatred as I have seldom seen upon a human face. Mr. Ferguson, may I suggest that you send Jackie overseas for a year, ideally two. And that should be a sufficient length of time to break him of this rather unwholesome affection that he has you. And even as friend Watson and I prepare to leave Lamberley, I wished Mr. Ferguson the best of luck as he endeavored to repair the damage he had already undergone, to win back, if possible, the love of his second wife. And so, ladies and gentlemen, Watson and I had brought the matter of this Sussex vampire to a close with nary a clove of garlic nor a wooden stake. In sight. Although, do you know, ladies and gentlemen, this grotesque affair vis-a-vis vampires does rather remind me of another purportedly supernatural case. Now, I believe it was in the year 89. At Langham's Hotel, a friend Watson and I dined with an editor of a magazine, a Lippincotts, from across the Atlantic, Mr. J.M. Stoddart. It was there I made the acquaintance of a remarkable man, perhaps you also will have heard of him, Mr. Oscar Wilde. During the course of the evening, Oscar and I discussed many fascinating subjects, our shared appreciation of sensational literature, the cultivation of rare and exotic orchids, our perceived shortcomings of the British legal system. However, it was all I could do to stop Mr. Wilde drifting back upon the one topic that seemed to govern his mind that night. But truly, if Mr. Wilde was to be believed, the one thing that surpassed even the physical beauty of Mr. Dorian Gray, with the salacious rumors being whispered about him in polite societal circles. Now, I urged friend Oscar to exercise extreme caution, lest he and Mr. Gray fall into the hands of the king of the blackmailers. Of course, you will have heard of Mr. Charles Augustus Milverton. However, Mr. Wilde nearly defended Gray. He said that as far as he was concerned, half the things whispered abroad about him were not true. Oscar, but what of the other half? However, upon reflection, when all is said and done, wickedness is nothing more than a myth to account for the curious attractiveness of others, is it not? Morality is nothing more than a stance we adopt toward those whom we personally dislike. I remember Oscar clapped his hands and laughed. Oh, Sherlock, I wish I had said that. Now, don't worry, Oscar, you will. You will. Now, the reason why I tell you this, it does rather remind me of another grotesque affair. The curious case of Professor Presbury, There Watson, with his usual gift for reticence, chose to write up this case under the rather catch-penny title of The Adventure of the Creeping Man. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I believe it was upon a September evening when Watson had been good enough to drop in once more upon Baker Street. You understand he had married again? Or was it for a third time? I have long since ceased to keep track of his romantic entanglements. But then again, the fairer sex always has been Watson's department. Nonetheless, now I was here. I informed Watson that I was giving some serious consideration to writing a monograph upon the uses of dogs in criminal detection. No doubt, ladies and gentlemen, if you will be so kind as to cast your minds back to the Copper Beeches affair, by observing the child, I was able to ascertain the true nature of the father. So it is with dogs. Or I mean to say, who ever heard of a playful dog in a gloomy household? Or an aggressive dog in a happy one? No, snarling people keep snarling dogs. Dangerous people keep dangerous ones, which brings me to the curious affair of Professor Presbury. Why should the faithful wolfhound Roy suddenly turn upon his staid middle-aged master? Now, it is true, Roy only does this upon certain occasions. Also, he has not turned against any other members of the household. A curiouser and curiouser, as Lewis Carroll would have said. However, have I not already said this evening, one cannot theorize without sufficient data? You understand, I consider myself to be a brain, the rest merely an appendix. But bricks and clay, one cannot make bricks without data. At that point, I heard the footfall of the private secretary to Mr. Presbury, young Mr. Bennet. And no doubt, ladies and gentlemen, friend Bennet would soon be able to enlighten us as to the enigma that was his employer. Why, good heavens, Mr. Holmes, I really am terribly thankful that, you're not alone. You're Dr. Watson, of course. Well, you will appreciate, will you not, that a scandal must be avoided at all costs. Professor Presbury, my employer, he is admired so much in academic circles that, as long as you can give me your word, Dr. Watson, that then I crave your apology. Well, Mr. Holmes, I brought my scribbling diary. I have made a careful note of all the pertinent facts. Well, before we proceed, I will perhaps be well advised to explain a little more. I am one of Professor Presbury's students. He has also done me the utmost honor of employing me as his private secretary. Yes. I live under the same roof as Professor Presbury and as well as his daughter, Edith. You're all perfectly aboard, I assure you. No, I'm engaged to Edith. We are to be married. Yes, yes, a capital girl. Well, I would say that. I'm married, of course. Oh dear. Where was I? Oh, yes. Well, you understand, Professor Presbury is not a young man, 61 years of age next year. However, he is a virile, a combative personality. Well, that is to say, he puts his back into everything, so to speak. Oh dear. Well, you understand, a colleague of the professor's, Professor Morphy, has a daughter who is younger than him. Well, of course she would be, would she not? Well, Professor Presbury has decided to court a young Miss Morphy. Well, Professor Presbury is a very wealthy man, and therefore Professor Morphy is more than happy to overlook the chasm between their ages. Well, it was at that time that suddenly Professor Presbury announced that he was to be away for a week or two. Well, I asked him where he was going, but he declined to inform me. Well, I only happened to learn when I received a chance correspondence from a fellow student. Well, he wrote to me saying what a pleasant surprise it was to see the professor over in Prague. Well, Prague. But why on earth was he being so secretive, Mr. Holmes? Well, when Professor Presbury returned, there was something different about him. His intellect remained in no way impaired, but he was a bit sly. It's furtive, one might almost say. But despite that, his lectures remained as scintillating as always. Now, the professor began to receive correspondence from the east end of town. All of these are letters and parcels marked with a tiny cross beneath the stamp. The handwriting almost illegible. Try as I might to decipher the same. Oh, yes. Professor Presbury brought back with him from Prague a rather quaint small box, quite en vogue in the Germanic regions at this time, Edith, my fiancée, informs me. You understand, it was one day I was in the study endeavoring to find some papers belonging to the professor. Well, I saw some papers stacked beneath the box. I touched the box when suddenly the professor leapt across toward me, snatched the box from my hands and demanded that I never again touch the same. Well, I was only trying to help. Well, it was then that events began to take a strange turn. Well, I made a note of it in my scribbling diary. Yes. Well, that first outburst of temper, that first display of asperity was upon the 2nd of July. Thereupon, it was on the 11th of July, and upon the 20th of July. Indeed, it was at that point that Roy, the wolfhound, suddenly turned against the professor. Well, he is a wonderful creature. That is why it made us quite sad to have him chained in the stable. So that's Roy, the wolfhound, of course, not Professor Presbury. Yes. However, matters came to an awful head one night upon the 4th of September. Now, gentlemen, you must appreciate, I've always been a light sleeper. That night was no exception. I was in my own room, pacing the floor. I long since forgone any hopes of slumber that evening. But suddenly, Mr. Holmes, I could hear a strange sound issuing from the hallway, the other side of my door. Well, I put on my dressing gown and I went out there to investigate. There! Oh, good heavens, there was a figure crouching outside the professor's bedroom door. It wasn't a human, but like some obscene, gigantic spider. It was squatting upon the floor. It began to crawl along the corridor toward me. The head was hanging so low between the arms. Nearer and nearer toward me it came. While I was frozen with fear to the spot, I was scarce even cry aloud in alarm. Slowly, the figure came to my feet, and then it stopped, and by degrees, it drew itself fully erect to reveal the face of Professor Presbury. Well, he called me an absolute, well, never mind what he called me, but spat out the word, and then he scampered off into the shadows over there. Well, the following morning, of course, he made no allusion whatsoever to the affair at the breakfast table, but I made a note of it in my scribbling diary. But the reason why I'm here today, gentlemen, is what happened last night. I mean to say, to his own daughter, to my fiancée, Edith. Edith was awoken, she says, by the sound of Roy, the wolfhound barking. She had not drawn the curtains, so the light of the moon was shining into her bedroom chamber. Suddenly, you must conceive of poor Edith's horror when there, silhouetted against the nighttime sky, emerged a hand, an arm, and then the long fingers gripped the window ledge, followed by another arm, followed by the upper torso, and then, to my poor darling's horror, she saw the face of this miscreant pressed against the glass. It was none other than her own father, my employer, the professor. Then conceive of her terror, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, when the professor began picking at the lead in the window. He was endeavoring to break into his own daughter's room, or heaven knows what his intentions were. Well, thankfully, at that instance, the wolfhound began barking again, and the professor's attention was diverted, and then he swung from view. Naturally, poor Edith was distraught. And yet again this morning, no mention at all was made of this by Professor Presbury. Now, a scandal must be avoided at all costs, gentlemen. We have the professor's academic standing to think of, but please, Mr. Holmes, I beg of you, you must find the answer as to why the professor suddenly has begun to act in such a strange way. Indeed. Now, given that friend Watson happened to be here, I asked for his professional opinion as a man of medicine. Why should Professor Presbury suddenly have started acting in such a peculiar fashion, creeping and crawling about his own home in the dead of night? Now, Watson thought for a moment and then suggested, by way of answer, lumbago. Very well, Watson. In that case, why do you think that Professor Presbury suddenly departed for Prague, and then his behavior changed so dramatically afterwards? Again, Watson thought, well, he suggested, given the impending marriage between Presbury and young Miss Morphy, no doubt further finances needed to be secured. He had gone overseas to Prague with a view to obtaining a loan. Yes, Watson, no doubt the wolfhound disapproved of this transaction. Rubbish! I cannot arrive at solutions without data, otherwise I'm akin to an engine racking itself to pieces. I'm not wired up to the work for which I am designed. No, Mr. Ferguson, rest assured, we will accompany you back to Camford. And ladies and gentlemen, I know not, will any of you be familiar with the small university town of Camford? And that was not a rhetorical question. I am asking you. Yes, you. If you smile and shake your head, I will understand. Well, I told Watson that he would like to find cover for his surgeons. Of course, he made the usual whinnying and grumbling noises regarding his patients, but what were their boils and their gout to do with me when I had a scientific problem to solve? Now, ladies and gentlemen, if ever any of you find yourselves in Camford, may I recommend the Checkers Inn. It is a place where the port is a little above the mediocre and the linen is beyond reproach. Now, I must espy Professor Presbury for myself. I sent him my business card informing him that my services had been requested. As I suggested to friend Watson, there would have been a period of excitement upon the 26th of August. Very good. We will suppose that the professor is always a little hazy as to recollecting what did or did not take place at that time. Nonetheless, we can but try. And we can but try, ladies and gentlemen, the motto, surely, of the firm. However, as I was soon to discover, the memory of the professor was a little bit better than I had given him credit for. Hey, what is it, Mr. Holmes? I've heard of you, Sherlock Holmes, the busybody, Sherlock Holmes, the meddler, Sherlock Holmes, the Scotland Yard Jack in office. Speak up now. Oh, you say it's been suggested to you that I need your help. And who may have said that? Benny! Now, do you not go anywhere, doctor? Is that what you call yourself, Watson, a doctor? Eh? Now, do you not wriggle off the end of this hook quite so easy as all of that? Well, Mr. Holmes, do you have any evidence? Do you have some correspondence, a telegram even? Benny! My secretary, Benny, if you have corresponded in any way, he will have a record of this. Now, if, as I firmly believe, you are lying, Mr. Holmes, stay there, Watson. Mr. Holmes, if you are lying, then by God, believe me when I say I will have the utmost satisfaction in giving you the damnedest good hiding of your life. Benny, where are you, man? What a charming individual. Thankfully, friend Bennett arrived in the nick of time, else I fear I would have had no option other than to demonstrate to the professor my expertise in the art of bartitsu. Now, whilst those two gentlemen were otherwise engaged, I decided not to waste the opportunity. Watson, come. We would investigate for ourselves the scene of the bizarre occurrence of the preceding night. Yeah. Miss Presbyterian's bedroom window, I suppose. And yet you will observe there is no ladder to be seen. A difficult enough climb, it is true, for an ordinary man, and yet already I begin to think Professor Presbyterian is anything but an ordinary man. But for all of that, you will espy a creeper above the window and a water pipe beside it, yes? A climb, albeit a difficult enough one, for a young man. Now, at that juncture, young Benny came racing toward you, holding aloft a piece of paper. He apologized profusely for his employer's behavior. However, having conducted business with the likes of Moriarty and Moran, I am not easily shocked. As to that piece of blotting paper, Bennet had been able to ascertain the name of Professor Presbyterian's mysterious East End correspondent. Dorak, it said upon the blotting paper. Dorak, D-O-R-A-K, Dorak. A curious name. A Slavonic, I believe, in origin. Now, at that point, Presbyterian began demanding Bennet's immediate company. Now, I feared Bennet would have a most uncomfortable afternoon's work. However, nothing more could be gleaned by my remaining here in Camford. However, rest assured, Mr. Bennet, I will return at the first glimmering of another period of excitement, which I believe will be next Monday evening. You will, of course, be so good as to inform me. Goodbye, Mr. Bennet. Watson, come along. Now, on our way back to the railway station, I called into the post office. I sent a telegram to an agent of mine named Mercer, apropos the identity of this Dorak. When I returned to Baker Street that night, his reply was awaiting my attention. Dorak, it transpired, ladies and gentlemen, was an elderly, rather suave individual. He owned a general store in the Commercial Road. There we have the Prague connection, you understand. I wonder, ladies and gentlemen, did you observe Professor Presbyterian's knuckles? Did you? Thick and calloused in a way that was quite unique in my experience. And whenever you are called upon to observe, always pay attention to the fingernails first, and thereafter the callosities between thumb and forefinger. They're upon these shirt cuffs, the coat sleeves, the trouser knees, and the boots. I trust you are paying attention. There will be questions asked before the end of the evening. As I had thoroughly expected, the following Monday evening, I received word from friend Bennet, pleading with us to return to Camford, and more correspondence received from the east end of town. And so it was, Watson and I found ourselves once more returned to the Presbyterian household. Already, you appreciate, the witching hour was close upon us. And there we were ensconced in the shrubbery, waiting and observing. There, Watson, do you see there we had Professor Presbury, his own home, standing in the doorway. Do you observe what a curious stance he has adopted, that habit he has of his head oscillating from side to side? Rather reminds me of the late lamented Moriarty himself. The way he allows his arms to dangle, the way his upper torso juts forward, rather simian, do you not think? At that juncture, Presbury fell to his hands and knees, began to caper and to cavort up and down the gravel driveway before his home, almost as though he suffered from a surfeit of the joy of life itself. And then Presbury came to the creeper that clung to the side of the household. And then, hand above hand, Presbury began to climb up the creeper until he was up the wall of the house, silhouetted in the moonlight. Some nightmarish bat. He released his hold and fell as silently and as effortlessly to the ground as he had ascended from it. Now, in the distance, we could hear the wolfhound Roy begin to bark. Once more, the professor began cavorting up and down the driveway. There, around the corner of the house, we saw Bennett emerge. We could see Presbury begin to taunt Roy, the wolfhound, begin to shake his hands before his face, to pick up small pieces of stone, to fling them into the face of that poor animal. Now, I pray, Watson, the dog does not escape from his leash. Watson, the hound! Thankfully, Bennett had managed to drag Roy away from the professor as man and beast had tumbled in a deathly combat. Now, even as Roy once more was chained in the stables, Watson attended to the distraught Professor Presbury. Now, Roy's jaws had come dangerously close to the carotid artery. However, the wound looked much worse than it actually was, nothing more than swathes of bandage. And a percentage of morphia could not put right. Morphia, you really ought to try sometime. Now, whilst Watson and Bennett attended to their academic, I decided to investigate this curious box that the professor had brought back with him from Prague. You will understand that since my encounter with Mr. Culberton Smith, I've always regarded such items with a healthy degree of caution. However, having ascertained that this posed no immediate peril, the lock itself was easy enough to pick. Within, what do we have here? Hello. A quantity of files. Empty. A correspondence. Oh, of course, receipts and invoices. And then an envelope written in a much more scholarly hand with an Austrian stamp bearing the postmark of Prague.
Honored colleague, since your esteemed visit, I have thought much of your case. And though in your circumstances there are some special reasons for the treatment, I would nonetheless enjoin caution, as my results have shown that it is not without danger of a kind. It is possible that the serum of anthropoid would have been better. I have, as I explained to you, used black-faced Langueur because a specimen was accessible. Langueur is, of course, a crawler and climber, while anthropoid walks erect and is in always nearer. I beg you to take every possible precaution that there be no premature revelation of the process. I have one other client in England, and Dorak is my agent for both. Yours, with high esteem, H. Lowenstein.
I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, but could you hear that voice also? Mrs. Hudson, will you kindly leave that gramophone alone? Lowenstein, of course, an obscure enough and yet within medical circles, infamous practitioner, he had made it his quest, as it were, to discover the secret of a youthful evanescence, the secret of eternal youth. And no doubt Professor Presbury had decided to transact business with Lowenstein. No doubt he felt that it was the only thing he could do to secure the affections of the much, much younger woman. It was not the professor, but the monkey that the wolfhound attacked. Dogs do not make mistakes. Have I not already told you that? As to this other client of Lowenstein, shortly thereafter, I discovered that he also was a medical man, or rather dour, staid, respectable man, answering to the name Henry Jekyll. Now, if rumors were to be believed, Jekyll had fallen into very bad company indeed, a miscreant named Edward Hyde, who made Mr. Dorian Gray seem an absolute paragon of the virtues. In comparison, well, if he be Mr. Hyde, I determined I would be Mr. Seek. And I would track the source of this evil to its root. And yet, when all was said and done, ladies and gentlemen, was Professor Lowenstein actually the cause of this evil? Think, will you not? Whenever one endeavors to rise above nature, how easy it is to fall beneath it. And one deviates from the straight and narrow path of destiny at one's own choice. Of course, the material, the worldly, the sensual, they would not hesitate to prolong their own worthless lives. Would this not in the end become a survival of the least fit? Consider, would our poor, tired old world not become such a cesspit in the end? Well, ladies and gentlemen, you have impinged upon my time for long enough one evening. I invite all of you now to make your own way out. Mrs. Hudson will be so good as to show you the way. If you cannot find her, then there is a rather tactful and helpful page boy here named Billy somewhere to be found. It is curious, is it not? There is so much violence in this world. The old wheel turns, and yet the same spoke always rises uppermost. It has all been done before, and no doubt will be done again. What is the reasoning behind so much misery, suffering, violence in the world? Surely there ought to be a point to it all. Because our existence is nothing more than a joke at our own expense, a mockery. Now that agent of Watson's, this Doyle, time and again he would have me believe that there is some higher providence, some greater good directing our activities upon this planet. Doyle would have me believe in some paradise, some nirvana. Rubbish! I do not believe in fairy tales, nor in vampires, nor in religious tracts. I need facts, data, not belief. No, I swear, ladies and gentlemen, Arthur Conan Doyle becomes more and more naive and credulous with every passing day. It would not surprise me, indeed, one of these fine days he would take to believing in fairies. Huh. Well, now you must leave me. I have another client to receive. Know now, however, that if you ever find yourselves in a circumstance desiring my services, at least you know where to find me. Know that I never vary my fees, save where I remit them altogether. And my professional fees are upon a fixed scale. Given friend Watson's interest in your trade, the bizarre, the supernatural, though grotesque, You'll indeed lament his loss at not making the acquaintance of my next client. Now, according to the letter that Mr. Montague Rhodes James has sent to me, he is indeed a remarkable young man, a provost of Eton, a scholar, an antiquarian, a medievalist. If Mr. James is to be believed, following the recent acquisition of a rather uncommon prayer book, a spate of rather unusual sightings have broken out upon college grounds, which is to say, ghosts. Mrs. Hudson, the door! Mr. Montague Rhodes James would have me believe in the existence of the supernatural. Yet, ladies and gentlemen, have I not already stipulated that this agency stands flat-footed upon the ground, and there it will remain? The world is scarce big enough for me. The ghosts need not apply. Need they? You're too kind, ladies and gentlemen. This has been Strictly Sherlock, brought to you in association with the Leeds Library and Leeds Literary Festival. And don't go into the Cellar Victorian Theatre with bite. You, ladies and gentlemen, have been an absolute joy to perform before, and until the next time, we are fated once again to enjoy one another's company in person. I bid you all good night.